Hello, welcome, and thank you to everyone joining us for the second in our series of history talks. And thanks to the Arts Institute at Plymouth University for hosting this series, one that has been put together jointly by the Historical Association Plymouth branch and the History Department at the university. I'm Alan Cousins from the Historical Association. In this talk, we move to a topic which is very relevant to this time of year, with November the 11th being Remembrance Day. It's interesting to reflect on changes in public memory about wars and their effects, and to think about the way memorialising has been undertaken over the years. You may also want to reflect on the nature of memory and of forgetting, and the connections between personal mourning and state commemoration. We're very pleased to welcome our speaker, who will talk about the history and work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Rebecca Smith grew up in Plymouth. She has worked in Brussels and Westminster and represents Plymstock Radford on the City Council. She's the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Public Engagement Coordinator, covering the region from Cornwall to Wiltshire. A large part of her role is introducing the public to the history of the Commission and providing an idea of what their work looks like today. And so I'm very pleased now to hand over to Rebecca.
Hello, and thank you for joining me on this presentation about the history and work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. My name's Rebecca Smith, and I'm the Southwest Public Engagement Coordinator for the Commission, and I work across the region, going out and about, talking to groups such as this, speaking in schools, doing site visits and tours of our sites and cemeteries. It's my privilege to be here around Remembrance Day, which I believe is roughly when this talk is going out. I hope it has an added pertinence at that particular time, but equally as interesting if you're watching this at a later date. I'm just going to share my screen and hide my video so that I can show you my presentation. Okay, so here we go. Rebecca Smith, Public Engagement Coordinator, and I'm going to be talking about the history and work of the CWGC. I always begin my presentations by briefly explaining what we mean by the Commonwealth. When we're talking about the work of the Commission, we're talking about these 6 member states: India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the UK. These were the 6 nations that formed to fight together as the Commonwealth forces in World War I and then again in World War II. There were other nationalities that fought underneath some of these flags. So, for example, the British West Indies will have fought under the British flag. But when it comes to 2020 and the upkeep of the 1.7 million graves and memorials that we look after around the world, it's these 6 countries that pay to do that and for us to look after their war dead. Initially, we were the Imperial War Graves Commission, but in 1960, the title was changed. When we're talking about war graves, we're talking not only about these well-known white headstones that you can see here in Tyncott. There's also a number of other types of graves that we look after and which are considered to be war graves. So I'm going to unpack a bit further in my talk about that. And we're called a commission because in 1917, George V, king at the time, gave us a royal charter, and that royal charter enabled us to call ourselves the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or as I mentioned, the Imperial War Graves Commission at the time. So that's why we have commission in our title. And this is a photograph of George V inspecting one of our sites in Belgium in about 1921, I believe. So this slide just gives you a little bit of information in numbers and picture form of the work that we do and some statistics. The 1.7 million casualties we commemorate in 23,000 locations around the world. The fact that the youngest casualty we commemorate is 14. And the fact that our biggest site holds 12,000 casualties buried. One I'll also mention later on as well is the fact that we still uncover an average of 36 casualties a year and rebury a similar number. The commission was created by a man called Fabian Ware. Might not be a household name, so you may well not have heard of him. I hadn't heard of him before I started in this role. But he is the man who is responsible for the fact that we can tell you where 1.7 million casualties are either buried or commemorated 100 years plus after he formed the beginnings of the commission. Fabian was about 45 when World War I started and was told that he was too young to go and join the front line. So rather tenaciously, he joined the Red Cross and he ended up on the Western Front under that guise instead. Pretty quickly, he saw that there was a very, very large number of casualties as a result of the conflict, and that it was going to be really important to identify where they were buried and who had died. This was particularly important because a decision had been made that casualties weren't going to be repatriated back home if they died. So it was going to be doubly important for families to know and to have a reassurance that their loved ones were buried somewhere and to be able to find those bodies at a later date. So he set up the commission and the rest is literally history. And we're not talking about iPads and Excel spreadsheets, we're talking about pencil and paper. But if he hadn't had that foresight, the work that we do today would be non-existent and we would have the travesty of 1.7 million casualties unidentified and with nobody knowing where they were buried. So for one man, I think he's got a pretty big legacy. Part of what he did was set up these principles of commemoration, that each of the dead should be commemorated by name on the headstone or memorial, that headstones and memorials should be permanent, and that they should all be uniform. So everything that we do revolves around the fact that a name is legible. So even if the rest of a headstone is not always fully readable, so long as the name is clear, we're happy. Headstones and memorials should be permanent, which is why I'm sat here today talking to you about this. And headstones should be uniform. So it didn't matter who you were, where you'd come from, or what rank you served in. All of the headstones were going to be the same shape and size. You literally have to be standing in front of a headstone to be able to distinguish anything about that person. Which leads me nicely onto this picture and slide about our headstone design. So what you will always find on a headstone is a regimental badge, or nearly always. There's always exceptions to all of the rules that I'm talking about this evening. The regimental badge identifies where this casualty served, who they served with. In this case, it's an Australian Imperial Forces casualty, but it might be an army regiment and the regimental badges are distinguishing features for those individual regiments, some of which don't exist anymore, so they're fascinating to explore. If you were in the Navy, you'd have an anchor. If you were in the Air Force, you'd have your the Air Force wings. And then depending on which Commonwealth country, you might also have a badge that represents that. So for example, the Canadian maple leaf and the New Zealand fig leaf and the New Zealand kiwi leaf, sorry, and the Australian sun emblem that you've got here. Then you'd also have their service particulars, so their service number and their rank, their name, who they served with, the date they died, and if we know it, the age they died as well. Essentially, a headstone is a memo of everything that we know about that individual casualty. So if we don't include it on a headstone, the chances are it's because we actually don't have that information. Then below that, you have a religious emblem. At the time of these cemeteries being built, this was quite controversial because many people believed that the headstone should be in a cross shape, but it was felt that they weren't going to be easy to maintain and would get damaged much more easily. So this design was the one that was used, but instead a religious emblem was incorporated into the engravings that were done. Clearly, they're not all crosses. You've got some Jewish graves, we've got Muslim graves, we've got other Indian graves that are all distinguishable by the religious emblem that's included. And then also slightly controversially was the fact that all of these headstones were uniform. Many of the families, particularly the women in the families, were not happy about this and wanted to be able to distinguish between their loved ones. So the Commission made a concession and enabled a personal inscription to be incorporated onto the headstone. There was a source of catalogue that Rudyard Kipling wrote, which had some more general comments you could include, or you could choose to write your own. Now this headstone here says, "He has gone where the weary always find rest. God bless my dear boy." Now that's quite a personal inscription, says a lot about the casualty. And then when you think about the fact that he's from Australia, buried in France, and that the head office of the Commission in England had written to his family in Australia, who've responded to say that they want this on his headstone, and then our stonemasons in France have engraved it onto the headstone, just goes to show the work that was done in the early 1900s to ensure that these casualties were adequately commemorated. So the First World War, we've talked already about the sheer number of casualties, but they were often needed to be discovered so that they could even be buried. And as Rudyard Kipling said, that was the single biggest piece of work since the pharaohs, and they only worked in their own country. So this is a picture of the teams that would go out and uncover the casualties so that they could be reburied. Pretty gruesome task when you think about it. Now, often we worked with large cemeteries near medical facilities. This photograph shows a very well-ordered cemetery with neat rows and crosses, and you can assume that there were very neat records that went alongside that. So over time, we would come in and adopt those sites and turn them into our now famous cemeteries. But it wasn't always that easy. Often they were laid to rest by their comrades. Now this looks relatively respectful. You've got a padre in attendance. You can see on the left-hand side of this photograph on the left, a row of neat graves that have already been buried where they've all got a cross. And then on the other side, you can see the graves that are ready to be filled with future casualties. And you can see the men paying their respects and carrying out an official service. But in the background of these photographs, you can also see Ypres and the ruins of Ypres. So just bear that in mind a bit later, because I'm going to show you a before and after photograph of this particular site to show what we did as cities like Ypres were rebuilt after the war. But then sadly, others were simply laid to rest where they fell. And this is a bomb crater, and you can see it's now filled with water. But around the edges, you've got these crosses with the names of casualties. And that's where the comrades will have respected their casualties who died enough to ensure that they placed a name to commemorate them by. But over time, whether the battle was re-fought over that ground or the land just fell in on itself, whatever was going to happen, you can't guarantee longer term that those crosses relate to the casualties that are buried beneath them. It becomes increasingly difficult to identify and to ensure that people have the correct burials. And of course, sometimes it was impossible to bury the dead at all, and they were just literally left where they had fallen. And these are often within that number of 36 casualties that we find still this year, who then need reburying as we discover them in the French and Belgian countryside. As we began our work, though, what we would do was concentrate casualties from far-flung battle spots to formalised sites such as this one. So this is Tyncott, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest site that we have. And you can see all these rows and rows of neat graves that are going to be very well organised, very easy to find, and you can see the photograph of them on the right-hand side. However, at the top here, you can see all these graves that don't really have any form to them. And that's because this site was actually once a hospital. And so they would have already buried these casualties here. So what we did was we didn't rebury them. We left them out of respect in that position and then built and concentrated the site around them and formalised what was there already. And then at each site, as we designed them, we also added in these focal points. So we added in a cross of sacrifice, and on the next slide, I'm going to show you our stone of remembrance as well. And these just, I suppose, break up these sites where you have vast numbers of graves and just provide a point that you can go and just reflect at. Where we have at least 40 casualties, you'll get a cross of sacrifice. They're not all this big. This is a particularly large one, again at Tyncott, built over the top of a blockhouse that formed the basis of the hospital building, and apparently has steps built into it to enable returning veterans to climb to the top and see the view across to Ypres, which you can just make out on the horizon in this photograph. But in the foreground, you can also see these randomly spaced out headstones as well, which relate to that picture I showed you just before of the graves that would have been in existence before the site was formalised. As you can see, we left them exactly where they were, and all we did was added in one of our commission headstones. And then where you have around 1,000 casualties as a minimum, we will put in place a stone of remembrance. This is seen as a more secular commemoration, a more secular memorial, but still a focal point to sites like this one, which, as you can see, are really rather large. And having that stone of remembrance at one end and the cross of sacrifice at the other just breaks up the thousands of graves, and it enables people to just go and reflect and pay their respects. And you'll often see a wreath or two laying there as well. I mentioned Ypres Reservoir Cemetery and these photographs of the Comrade burial, and you can see the destroyed town in the background and the trees that are completely dead. But fast forward, and this is what that site would look like today. Now we'll have formalised that site. You can see those straight lines of burials. Perhaps that's the same two rows that we're looking at in that previous photograph. But you can see just how beautiful that site is now, even down to the planting that takes place, which was designed at the time by horticulturalist Gertrude Jekyll, who, like the architects who designed the sites and the focal points, was well known in society at the time, and ultimately designed each of these plots to look like an English country garden. So where somebody is unknown, if we have a body, they're still buried. And that's where you get these unknown soldier graves. As you can see in the middle, this one here says the classic wording of a soldier of the Great War. Now, I assumed that every unknown soldier had the same headstone until I visited, and I saw that often you will have a British private or an Australian private, whatever way we can distinguish them because of what they're wearing or a badge that is on their arm. If we know that they are of a particular nationality and a particular rank, we'll include that on their unknown soldier graves. But where we don't know who somebody is and they're essentially missing, we created all these memorials, and they're world famous. You've got the Menin Gate, and here you've got Thiepval Memorial to the missing of the Somme. 72,000 names of missing soldiers on this memorial. Now, the chances are some of the unknown graves that we have in other nearby locations will relate to the casualties who are supposedly missing. But because we haven't been able to identify them, you will have an unknown grave, but also the name of a person on the memorial, such as this one. This site is particularly special because, unlike any of our other sites, it has some national flags flying. And that's because this site is particularly special to mark the relationship between France and Britain in the Battle of the Somme. And as a result, at the bottom here, you've got several hundred British graves and several hundred French graves to mark that work that was done together. But the sheer scale of the Tietval Memorial is worth experiencing. Here's the Stone of Remembrance, and here are some little people. And you can see why it has to be so big to hold 72,000 names. But it's also a brilliant example of how well our system works and how well our database works. Because if you're looking for a casualty on this memorial, our website will tell you exactly which column and panel their name is on. And although there are 72,000 names commemorated here, if you know who you're looking for, I can guarantee you'll be able to find them. Closer to home, you obviously also have the naval memorials, and these are at the different sending ports around the south coast of England. So our famous obelisk that's on Plymouth Hoe is one of 3 of its type, one in Plymouth, one in Portsmouth, and one in Chatham. And that particular view shows you that World War I obelisk that was built as a shipping navigational aid, and holds the names of all those who have no known grave other than the sea. And the way it worked was that you would be commemorated on the memorial in the town or city that was your home port. So all of the casualties pretty much on the Plymouth Memorial will have set sail from Devonport, and that's where their ships would have been based. But sadly, our ships that sunk at sea, and so therefore we don't know where their graves are. Each of the sites then has a World War II extension as well. And in total in Plymouth, that means we've got 23,000 names commemorated on that memorial now. And on the right here, you've got the Merchant Navy Memorial at Tower Hill. So not only did the Royal Navy play a massive part in both World Wars, but the Merchant Navy did too, and they were key. So we have not only memorials and graves for the RAF, the Army and the Navy, but also the Merchant Navy. And this, as we headed into World War II, we obviously saw the extent of where the fighting took place was, went beyond the realms of World War I and went to much further afield sites, which meant these new cemeteries had to be built to accommodate all the casualties that were killed in these more remote and exotic locations, I suppose. I love these photographs because to me, this just shows the permanency of the commission. So this is the cemetery in what is now Hong Kong. And as you can see, it's all laid out. It looks like those other cemeteries we've seen. But obviously there's not much to the city at all. This photograph to me just highlights how permanent our sites are. The graves haven't been moved as the city has developed around. The city has grown and the graves have remained where they are. And that's a pretty spectacular site. I've met people who've been to visit and they say it really is moving. It's miles and miles and miles away from home for the soldiers that were killed in that part of the world, but at least their families know that they were commemorated in a suitable and respectful way. And the same goes for sites such as this one in Singapore, where you have the Memorial to the Missing at the end here and the Kranji War Cemetery in front. And again, if your family member was from Devon somewhere or Somerset and they had died fighting in the Middle East, in the Far East, you're going to be partially comforted to know that they were at least memorialised or buried in sites such as these. And ultimately, it means it's visitable for families today who can travel to go and see where these casualties have their final resting place. Now, for both World War I and World War II, we have a set of dates. You have to have been killed and died of your wounds within those dates to qualify as a war casualty. It feels a little bit arbitrary, but obviously you have to put a stop somewhere or else we'd be commemorating for years and years and years. So these are the dates within which you have to have died to qualify to be commemorated by us as the War Graves Commission. Worth noting that the date in August in particular labelled large numbers of casualties of the Spanish flu to be classed as war victims. So for example, the camps in Wiltshire that housed the Australian and New Zealand soldiers ready to go home at the end of the war, where Spanish flu broke out, they would then still count as war dead, because that date enabled that death that took place, not necessarily because of their fighting, but because they were waiting to go home, to still count them as war casualties. So closer to home, I wanted to just show you some of what we do nearer to where we all live. So for those of you who don't recognise it, this is Plymouth Western Mill Cemetery. As you can see, this is one of those plots like we'd see all over France and Belgium, with the flowers and the planting in the front and the neat lines of graves. And this is where we would have formerly concentrated a large number of casualties. This site in particular has many from the Blitz night. So if you were to walk along these graves, you'd see many from those particular dates. But what we also have in the UK are lots and lots of scattered graves. And this is where a family would have had their own grave that they wanted their loved one to be buried in, but they may have chosen to have a commission headstone. So you don't get all of the planting and the plot in front of it, it's just simple grass. But we will ensure that anybody can walk up to that grave and read the name. Because if you remember back to what I said at the beginning, the key thing for us is that all of these casualties are remembered by name. But we also consider war dead who are buried in private memorials. So Charles Allen, who's shown here, this is still a war grave. So Charles Allen died in 1917 whilst serving in the Australian Imperial Forces over in the UK. But his family chose to bury him in a private grave and to put their own private memorial on top. So we will still ensure that his name is readable so that any of us who wanted to go and find him could do that. But we won't get involved with the upkeep of his actual headstone. However, I include this one because the fact that it has his photograph on it absolutely fascinates me. The fact that he's then also from Australia, and somehow this grave has been organised and ordered and his photograph has been included on it, I find particularly extraordinary. And to think that it's over 100 years old as well, it's one of my special ones that I always include in my presentations. One of the things that I've particularly enjoyed since I've been working for the Commission is how much about history you can learn from our sites and how things just open your eyes to the bigger picture. The photograph on the left is a headstone in France, I believe it is. And as you can see, there's a Star of David on it. So immediately that identifies this casualty as Jewish. Then on the top, I noticed that there were these couple of pebbles. And I thought, okay, I wonder if there's anything to do with the fact that he's Jewish, that is why these pebbles are on the top of the headstone. Now, subsequently, I found out that there is. But the next day, we were at another site in Belgium, and I found this other headstone that also had pebbles on the top. So I started to just think about what I was seeing. Now, this headstone here is actually a German casualty. The Germans use this style of headstone where they're buried in Commonwealth sites in Belgium. They have a slightly different headstone shape in France. But this is in Belgium, it's got the flat top, so the headstone lends itself really well to having the pebbles placed on the top. But if I'm surmising the same from the Jewish grave on the left and applying that to the grave on the right, I'm reasonably confident we could say that this is a Jewish casualty in this Belgian site as well, but that he's actually a German Jewish casualty. And I realised that I have never, ever thought about what the German Jews did in World War I. I've studied history, I've studied Jewish history. I'd never thought about what the Jews in Germany did in World War I. But if my thinking is correct, this headstone is a German Jewish soldier from World War I who fought like any other German soldier for his country and was killed in the process. So I just found that fascinating. I've never contemplated that before, but by seeing this grave here in Belgium, it just began to piece some of those things together in my mind. So I wanted to just answer a few hypothetical questions you might have. So these are questions that I would get asked if I was doing this talk live, and the answers that would go with them. They're not exhaustive. You're very welcome to get in touch with me after this if you'd like me to answer any other questions. But here goes with the ones I've included. What happens when you find casualty remains? Well, as I said, we find and rebury around 36 casualties a year. And this is what happens. They get full military honours. So when we find the casualties, they are given to the national organisations of whichever country they're found in to do the identification process. And they work with us, and eventually they're given back to us to rebury. We will also help with the research by looking at some of the artefacts that are found with the body. And we will find out as much as we possibly can about that casualty. So in the case of these 3 casualties that I'm about to show you, we know that 2 of them were Australian and 1 of them was British and fought with the Lancashire Regiment. We couldn't find out who they were and their names, but we knew that much. So we will bury them and give them an unknown soldier headstone that at least depicts that. So those 2 headstones you can see are the Australian soldiers, and they actually have the Australian regimental badge as well. And then the one on the left is the British. But you'll also see they get full military honours. And this is what we do time and time again when we rebury these casualties. We treat them as if they died just yesterday, and we ensure that they get this full military treatment. What about non-Commonwealth casualties? Well, if they are buried in the UK, we will look after their graves in the same way that we look after Commonwealth graves. Some countries actually have national cemeteries, so there's a very big German cemetery in the Midlands that has the vast majority of the German casualties that are buried in the UK, but not exclusively. And so Plymouth, for example, has 2 German casualties, one of which is in this photograph on the left here. And as you can see, it's a different shape headstone to that one I described in Belgium shortly a few minutes ago. In the middle, we have a Norwegian headstone that's in, both of these are incorporated in plots within bigger sites. So you can see that they've got all the same planting and they're looked after in exactly the same way. And then the one on the right is a Polish grave that is essentially a scattered grave. So this is a scattered grave in a cemetery site, and we would still ensure that you can walk up to it and read the name and look after it for, in this case, the Polish government. How can I find out where a relative is commemorated? Well, we have a very extensive database that is available online for free. Those 1.7 million casualties that Sir Fabian Ware helped to commemorate and to record are all available on our website. And everything that we have about that casualty is on there. So please do dig in and see what you can find. You can search with all sorts of fields, names, date of death, service number, a rough idea of which country they're buried in. Clearly, the more common names are harder to find, but it is pretty easy to access that database. Bear in mind, you'll sometimes get G's and J's muddled up and things like that. So all the common issues that you find in any sort of genealogy and ancestry work will apply here. So be prepared to try different scenarios to try and find the casualty, but our database really is excellent. I found a grave which is in bad condition. Why has this happened? Very good question. Here are 2 examples of private memorials where we have and haven't had to get involved. So on the left-hand side, you've got Lieutenant Quick's grave in Somerset. And as you can see, the lettering on that is still very legible. So we would just leave well alone with that one. We don't own it, so we don't have responsibility for its upkeep. However, if it ended up looking like the one on the right, where you can no longer read the writing, we will seek the permission of the family and install an alternative commemoration like this headstone in the foreground here. So where that's the case, we'll get involved. What you'll often get are some of our headstones go a bit green, particularly if they're situated under trees in cemeteries. We have a cleaning schedule for that, and we do go around and clean them at least every 2 years, but often more regularly where we have problem sites. But we're always open to people contacting us on the via the website to tell us if there are particular sites that they're concerned about. But what you'll also find is there are graves that are actually non-war graves that look like they are war graves that don't always look as nice as this one. So this is what we call an MOD grave, and it's at Ford Park Cemetery. Now Ford Park in Plymouth look after their graves very, very well. So this is clean, it's straight, but there are lots of sites where headstones like this won't look quite as nice and people will assume they're war graves. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll notice not only is the shape different, but the date is wrong for it to be a war grave. So this casualty died in 1950, And if you think back to those dates that I told you about, 1947 is the cutoff point for it to be a war grave. So sometimes these won't be quite straight, or they might be not particularly well accessible or looking as they should. However, increasingly the MOD is now actually paying the commission to look after quite a lot of these graves, and Weston Mill is a good example where they actually paid us to turn a load of MOD graves that are at the end of the Second World War plot into a plot like the war graves, and we have straightened them all, we've planted them all, and they look exactly as war graves would look. And finally, which local sites do I recommend? Well, across the southwest we've got just over 1,400 sites and just over 38,000 casualties commemorated, so you really can take your pick, but I've just put a couple of pictures here to whet your appetite. So from right going clockwise, you've got Headstone Cemetery in Tor Point here. Fascinating, because this row of casualties nearly exclusively lost their life in one air raid attack that landed at HMS Raleigh. So that's a particularly sad story. You've got Salcombe here, which obviously has a more naval feel. Scattered graves at Efford, but also some fascinating plots, including Greek Merchant Navy, Chinese Labour Corps, and all sorts of Commonwealth graves at the top. Here you've got Sutton Veny over in Wiltshire, where you'll get lots and lots of Australian and New Zealand casualties. And this is the other big plot at Weston Mill, which you can see looks like it could easily be in France or Belgium. We have a new part on our website called The Hub, where we're going to be adding more and more information about specific sites in the UK, and also opportunities for tours and things like that. So do check that out in due course. And finally, we have a foundation that is a charity we set up so that people like you could have a little bit more of a stake in what we do. You can pay to join, it's a very small amount of money, and it means you get to know what we're up to around the country, and also play a part in the work that we do to extend our engagement with younger generations, and to also enable volunteers to get out and do things like the cheery bunch of people on the bottom right here who are out and about keeping some of those scattered graves clean, and also recording what condition they're all in, which is vital to our work. We love social media at the War Graves Commission, and we have Facebook, Twitter and Instagram accounts that are the Commission in general. We also have a Facebook page that is specifically for the Southwest, which I manage, which you'd be very, very welcome to join. The more the merrier. It's where I include quite a lot of information about what's going on locally, and people share stories that they find as well. And also you can follow me if you want on Twitter. So I'm at Plymouth Rebecca. And although I don't tweet exclusively about the War Graves Commission, I do share quite a lot of the work that I do on there. So at Plymouth Rebecca on Twitter if you're interested. And if you have any questions, my email address is rebecca.smith@cwgc.org, or you can contact me via the inquiries email, which is accessible on the website. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this has just unpacked a little bit more about our work, and please do come back to me, rebecca.smith@cwgc.org, if you have any questions. And I'm going to leave you there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.